Well, welcome to week 3 of the series of 11 lectures. The first 4 weeks, remember, is your basic skills as a project manager, and we're in week 3 of those 4 weeks. And then weeks 5 to 8 will be managing your projects, and weeks 9 to 11 will be talking about the people in your projects. And once you've got those 3 things under your belt, you've learnt enough about project management to start thinking seriously about taking some professional exams to become a qualified project manager. And what we're going to do in today's lecture, the third of 4 in your basic skill set, is talk about everything to do with tasks. And I've helpfully put that little diagram up there, and somebody had to work out what all the tasks were to do that project, or those projects, because each one of those things, that might be a project, that might be a project, that might be a project. They could be run as separate projects, but clearly they're also all interrelated to each other. And even then, if you're doing that project, how many tasks would that consist of? And how would you work out what all those tasks were and what resources they need? And I think if you remember this from week 1, there's probably about 1.5 million or 2 million tasks that we've got to find in order to run that project. And clearly, that's no easy thing to do. Now, obviously, from one lecture, you're not going to find out exactly how to do that, but at least we'll know what principles are involved. So let's have a look at everything to do with tasks. And also, when we're doing that, we'll look at the idea of having outlines in our projects involving phases and milestones. By the end of the lecture, you'll know what a phase is and what a milestone is and what they're used for. You may already know. And we'll also look at different possible types of links between the tasks. The one there is the finish to start, and that's the usual idea that we've been talking about right the way through, where, for example, I put my t-shirt on and then I put my shirt on. So when I finish putting my t-shirt on, I put my shirt on. That's a finish to start link. One thing finishes, the next one starts. So what would this mean then, SS? They both start at the same time, or they both finish at the same time. And sometimes in a project or in cooking, I'm told, you do start things at the same time or arrange for them to finish at the same time, because you want all the meal to come together at the right point. Is that right? Anybody that does cooking? I cook sausages, that's about it. That's all I'm allowed to cook. And we can also have lags and leads between tasks. It doesn't have to be that when one finishes, the next one starts immediately. It might be that one finishes and then a few days later you start the next one. I'll give you an example of that. Suppose you hire a plasterer to plaster that wall. Can you paint it straight away? No. So what you do is arrange for a 4-day lag to let the plaster dry, and then you bring in a painter to paint the wall. But what you don't do is let the plasterer plaster the wall and then stand there watching it for 4 days while it dries. Why not? Cost the money, yeah, and waste the resources. So that labourer would go off somewhere else, or the plasterer would go off somewhere else while that lag is there. So you're only paying for the plasterer to plaster the wall, not to watch the plaster dry. And that makes perfect sense. Now, a lead is rather more complicated, but what that means is this task finishes, and 3 days earlier, this other task would start. I can't think of any sensible applications of that, but maybe if some of you are good chefs, you might be able to think of something along those lines. But certainly, not everything has to finish and then immediately start. Sometimes finish and a few days later start. Sometimes finish and a few days earlier start. Both are possible in the software. And we'll also consider how you can split tasks. You've got 4 days work to do, but they don't all have to be done 1, 2, 3, 4. You could leave a couple of days gaps and then do another day. And that way you can spread your tasks around in a way that makes sense for your particular task in your particular project. And finally, we're going to look at how we can add constraints to our tasks. Why and how would they be involved? So those are everything to do with tasks. And when we finish all of that, we should have a better idea about how that sort of project begins to run, or any other sort of project begins to run. And then in the seminars, what you'll be doing is using the software, and you'll be working on case studies in the software to help you understand how these things are done. Remember how to use the software 2 weeks ago in the seminars? Good. That's going to be assumed knowledge. You pick up on that and carry on with it in this afternoon's lecture or next Friday morning's lecture. All right, so let's make a start. And this is the sort of reminder, in a way, about what we talked about in week 1. It does no harm. Start your plan, your project, formulate your project goals clearly. What must be accomplished? What's the scope? And remember, when you're doing the scope, it's what is included as well as what isn't included. You've got to be very specific about both of those things. Otherwise, your clients, your stakeholders are going to get confused and there won't be any clear budget or finish time. And when you set the scope, also, you think about the assumptions. And we did mention this in week 1, but I just want to ram it home. Suppose we're thinking of that example of building a 3-bed house on a plot of land, which we did think about in week 1. Some of the assumptions would be these sorts of things, but when we say what it includes and doesn't include, at the edges of the project, these things need to be decided. You haven't defined the project unless you defined its scope, which is what is included and what is not included. So does it include landscaping, or do we just leave all the dirt outside the house for the people that buy it to landscape it? Does it include interior design? Do you need a garage? And if it's a garage, what sort of garage would it be? Would it just have opening doors, or would it have rolling doors? Those things you have to decide on any project, whatever its context. But the scope will determine those 3 important things: the budget, the required resources, and the probable finish date. So you've got to get your scope agreed with your stakeholders and your financiers. And then you will have a feasible plan. Now, examples of the assumptions, again, sticking to that example about building a house, I've written some assumptions there that you might make for that project. And each project has its own assumptions. So we will have assumed, for example, that 4 labourers will be on the site every day. Now that assumption means the project can proceed at a certain rate. If you had fewer labourers than that on the site, what would happen? Probably slow it down. And if you had more labourers than that, you may well be able to speed up your project. It might not be your decision. The contractors will probably decide how many labourers are on the site, and they might vary it day by day depending on their own particular problems and other projects that they're dealing with. But we make the assumption in our project plan there'll be 4 labourers on the site every day. And that's how we come with a feasible finish date. We also quite often make this second assumption: the cost of the labour and the cost of the materials remain the same. And on a fairly short project, of course, that's not controversial. But suppose it's an 8-year-long project. Is that likely to be true?
No.
But how could you change it?
The cost of material.
But how much and when?
You can't do it.
We can't know, can we? We can't know now what will happen to wages and prices over the next 8 years. We could try and guess, but it would be no more than that. It would be a guess. So it's easier to come up with a plan that assumes the cost of materials and the labour rates stay the same. They won't, but what else can we do? So we have to be aware of that when we price the project and make it clear to the stakeholders that it's based on current prices. And that's a reasonable assumption to make. We also assume the cement mixer will arrive on a certain date. Now that's using JIT. It's an example of JIT. What's JIT? Yeah, that's a Japanese system of ordering things only when you need them to be on site. So we don't build a house and get all the materials there on day 1. We build the house and get materials arriving and labour arriving just when we need it. So the roofing materials and the roofers arrive just as the roof's about to go on. That makes perfect sense. And that final assumption, not so bad in this country. Does the weather remain fine here?
No.
But in other countries, that can be quite serious. And there's an example of the Commonwealth Games in Africa a few years ago. They have a wet season, don't they? Rainy season. And there's normally a time when the rainy season finishes, on average. And what they did is come up with a project plan that said, well, the average finishing time of a rainy season is there. We'll start the building then. And what happened that particular year, do you think? Have a guess. The rainy season was a month late finishing. What does that do? Oh dear. And the consequences of that for something like the Commonwealth Games is horrific, because they're published to happen on a certain date. And they plan to have 5 months to build it all, and instead they've only got 4 months to build it all. Imagine the chaos that must have caused. There was a happy ending, luckily, and the Commonwealth Games did go ahead, and it went ahead on time and to specification. But probably not to what? What would be the third thing? Time, specification, and the iron triangle? Cost. Costs would have gone higher because of that, obviously. But those sorts of assumptions have to be made to come up with a feasible project plan. And you have to be aware of what they are, and everybody else has to be aware of what they are. The contractor has to know you're assuming there's going to be 4 labourers on site, because they are responsible for making sure that happens, and therefore your plan can go ahead. That's just saying the same thing that I've just said. And contingency plans are okay, but of course there's a limit to what sort of contingency plans you can build into your project, because when you build in contingency plans you add cost, and if you add cost to your project plans, the projects may not get accepted anyway. So the whole thing can just collapse in a heap around your ear rolls. So create and refine the plan. You've got to create the task list. That's not so easy if you're building a nuclear power station. But if you're recruiting new staff or running an event, then there aren't that many things that have to be done, but you are responsible for sitting down on your own or with other people and trying to work out what tasks need to be done. So you have a project plan, you have a scope, you've made assumptions, but now what things need to be done, by whom, and with what raw materials, and how much therefore will they cost. And that way you're beginning to build up your project plan. So you need to create that task list. You also need to estimate the duration of each of those tasks and put them in a logical order, like you put your t-shirt on, then you put your shirt on. And establish any dependencies between the tasks and work out assigned staff, equipment and costs. Is that easy to do all of that? Think of that nuclear power station, 1.5 million tasks. Ouch. Find them all and then work out all those different things about those tasks. Pretty hard. So actually, it's very important, very difficult and very time consuming to get that task list assembled. Obviously. And to help you, the Association of Project Management Body of Knowledge has a nice little quote about things called products or deliverables. And while you're building up your task list, it can help you if you focus on the products or the deliverables of your project. And depending on the context of the project, that is anything that is produced by or on the way through the project which can be identified, described and is tangible and measurable. And one way you assess how well a project is going is by whether it is delivering its deliverables on time and to specification and so on. So it's a useful thing to think about in the back of your mind, when I'm running this project, what are the deliverables? So if you're recruiting new staff, what are the deliverables?
Candidates.
Yes? Any others?
These are the required skills.
A list of required skills. Yeah, that's a deliverable. That can be seen, can't it? Yeah. What else? A booked room for the interviews. That's a deliverable.
Candidate responding to the application.
Well, candidate, yeah, we're assuming the candidates are coming in and somebody can see whether the candidate's coming in. If you set up a whole thing and there are no candidates, it's wasted completely.
Might be setting up an interview panel.
Yes, and then the panel exists, and the date, and the room is booked, you get the idea. So that can help you focus on how the project is going to work. Whatever the project is, it will have deliverables. So think about what those are. And to get that list of deliverables, or tasks, or both, is going to need a great deal of knowledge about the project that you're involved with. In week 1, we gave you the example of the nuclear particle accelerator. You remember that? The 30-kilometre ring in CERN in Switzerland. And that involves physicists, project managers, electricians, contractors, all sorts of people that don't even talk a common language. I don't mean Swiss, English and German. And it makes it very difficult then for you to talk to those different people, but you will have to talk to experts and you will have to gather information from people associated with your project. You don't have to believe them all, but you certainly have to talk to them all to find out what's going to happen. And as the task list gets bigger and becomes more complicated, then it's very likely that you'll want to break it down to include phases and milestones. Now, a phase would be a logical grouping of tasks, and you might group them for a number of reasons. In building our house, one phase would be the foundations, another one would be the walls and the roof. They would all be different phases, and each phase would consist of a number of connected logical tasks. Or you might group it in a phase, because that phase is all those tasks that involve certain people who are managed by this person. So there can be different reasons why you might group tasks into phases. But it's your discretion as how you would break your project down into phases, sort of super tasks that consist of tasks underneath them. And then a milestone would just be a marker, and quite often we put these markers at the beginning or the end of a phase. So a milestone is a little marker, and in Project and other software you'll see that little black diamond, and when you see that little black diamond appear in the Gantt chart where the blue and the red bars are, that means it's a milestone, and it will have a 0 duration and therefore a 0 cost, and it is a milestone. And you use it to sort of make a marker for people at the end of the phase. So each phase will have one of those little milestones with a date on it, and the people working on that phase aim at that milestone. Now that's quite useful, because if you are working on an 8-year-long project, are people working in year 2 really interested in your finish date in year 8? No. But if you give them a date in year 2, in the month that they're working, and say that's our milestone, then that's what they aim at, and that's what you judge them against. So you're giving people in a smaller stage of your project a target to aim towards, a milestone to reach. Now, to build that task list, remember it could be 1 million tasks, a couple of thousand tasks, 100 tasks, whatever it is. There are 2 approaches that you can use. One approach is called top-down. So what's the other approach called? Bottom-up, yeah. So let's think about those 2 systems. And a top-down approach would do this. First of all, get all the big people, the big managers, into a room and talk to them about what they think the phases are. Just that. What are the phases? But then go off into smaller rooms with subgroups and talk about each phase individually. And then break it down further if you need to. So you think from the big picture and then work down to the detail. And with luck, that way you'll end up with your 1.5 million tasks in time. It's not instant, it takes a long time, but hopefully you'll get there. And that has some very clear advantages. You do get an immediate overview of the project from the major players in it. And you can also break out into phases with relevant staff into those phases who know about those phases, who can help you break them down further. And you get, therefore, some early ownership of those phases. So it helps you get a sort of management structure in position, helps you motivate people and get them doing the things that they're interested in. Now the bottom up works the other way round. Get everybody into a giant room and get them all to write down every single task they can think of, and get a great big pile of paper, 1 million bits of paper with every task written on it. Then look at each bit of paper and think, which phase does that belong to? And then put it into that phase's pile of paper. And sort of gradually work up to the giant phases. Does that make any sense? Would you do it? Which way would you do it? The top down or the bottom up?
Go for the top now.
And most people do. But actually, the bottom up has some advantages. And interestingly, the advantages that the bottom up has are precisely the disadvantages of the top down. So if you're doing a bottom up build, you're less likely to miss things that sort of belong between your phases. You won't even find them in a top-down build, but in a bottom-up build, somebody would have written down on a bit of paper. And then it doesn't really belong with this phase, it doesn't really belong with this phase. So it ends up being missed out in your top-down build. Okay? Alternatively, you could have a task that logically belongs in more than one phase. And if you're doing a top-down build, it'll end up being done 3 times in 3 different phases. When will you find out that's happened?
When you started to do
When 3 people turn up to do the same job, which is not too clever. And of course that will have affected the price of the job as well. So what's interesting is probably what we're going to do is a top-down build. Everybody does. But when you're doing it, beware of those 2 sorts of tasks. The tasks that don't really belong to your phases, that fit in between them, if you like, or the tasks that could potentially end up in more than one place. And be aware that they exist, and be careful how you might deal with those. And again, that's going to involve some discussion for you. But whichever method you use, and I've broken this rule myself, identify your tasks as precisely as possible. And all the exercises I've set you so far, we call the tasks A, B, C, don't we? That's a pretty stupid thing to call tasks, because that doesn't mean anything to anybody. So when you're giving your tasks names, use sensible and consistent descriptions that make sense to people. I'm going to plaster the living room. I'm going to wire the bathroom. Whatever it is, use that name for your tasks that people understand what it is. And then make sure everybody knows the scope and assumptions at task level when you're talking to them or briefing them about what they've got to do. And the milestones, we've already said, we add milestones to your project to try and spot trouble locally. So if people are not meeting their milestone in that phase on year 2 of an 8-year-long project, you already know something's wrong with your project. And you can talk to them about how to get it back on track. So that's the first reason for using milestones. But there's another reason why you might use milestones, and that's to include things in your project which are not directly your own responsibility. And I think I can make that clearer for you if I give you some examples. So you're running a project. Let's look at this first one. The advertising campaign begins. I put a little milestone in my project because what I'm doing is delivering stuff to stores. So I'm responsible for delivering the chicken to Kentucky Fried Chicken. Did you read that story? Does anybody eat Kentucky Fried Chicken? Not now, obviously. Anyway, I'm responsible for the company that sends the chicken to Kentucky Fried Chicken. And they're running a big advertising campaign to get more people to come there. Okay, I'm not responsible for that advertising campaign, but I need to know it's on track and it happens on time. Why?
There's a correlation with that.
Because then I start shipping out more chicken.
Yeah.
Advertising campaign starts, more people will buy chicken. So more chicken needs to be delivered to the shops. Yeah? Suppose the advertising campaign runs late and I don't know about it. I deliver more chicken to the shops, what happens to it? Oh dear, yes. And we're then delivering rotten chicken to people a week later when the advertising campaign kicks in. Or do it the other way around, it's even worse, isn't it? Suppose they do the advertising campaign really well and it happens a fortnight early. Now what happens? Oh, flip. Not good news, is it? So though the advertising campaign is not my responsibility and nothing to do with my project, it has a bearing on my project. So put in a milestone to remind yourself to check that the advertising campaign has started or is about to start or is on schedule. And there's another one there, the next finance tranche available. I don't put the money in there, somebody else puts the money in there. But if it's not there, what problem might that cause? Yeah, can't pay anybody. Can't pay for anything, can't pay salaries, and your project's in trouble. So though you don't put the money there, and it's not your responsibility, you need to know it's available, or your project's going to grind to an embarrassing halt. And I've got another one there, product specification agreed. And there could be many other reasons why you might put a milestone, just as a little reminder to yourself in your projects. Now, estimating task duration, we've already talked about that. Even for a simple task in a simple project, how long will it take to do? I'm going to plaster that wall. How long will it take to do? How do we find out that information? Well, of course, it depends on the assumptions we make. If one person's going to plaster that wall, how long do you think it might take? Have a guess.
2 days.
2 days?
A day.
Okay. But if 2 people plaster it, how would that change?
A day.
It would be quicker, wouldn't it? Some project managers say if one person can do it in 4 days, 2 people can do it in 2 days. It might not quite work that way, but at least it will be on those lines. So you've got to make that assumption, but even that is a guess in a way. Even on that simple project, how long will it take to do that? Well, flip. Let's talk to the plasterers. Let's think about other jobs that have been done, and let's try and work out how long it takes. Got it? So experience on similar things, guess, or ask experts in the field to try and find out how long each of your tasks would make, given the assumptions you've made about resources and raw materials. And to get good estimates, you do need to cross-reference and look in other places to get evidence, supporting evidence for your assumptions that you've made about the task durations. And sometimes, in something that's really difficult to do, that's never been done before, you may also look at pessimistic, optimistic, and most likely times and come up with some statistics. And that's where statistics overlaps with project management. We probably won't really go into that. I'll send you some notes that I'm not going to examine you on about risk and uncertainty in projects, but we can't squeeze it into 11 lectures, although it's very important. So it will be there and you can have a look at it. But I won't examine you on it. Now, so seminars next week, all about tasks. We want you to be using the software. So we're back to Microsoft Project. And the first thing we're going to do when we start in the seminars this afternoon or next Friday morning is put in what's called recurring tasks. Not everybody uses these. What are they? Well, they're little team meetings. So every Friday we'll get together and discuss how the project is going. So that's what a recurring meeting would be, a recurring task. And there are ways of adding recurring tasks into your project, and we'll do that. We'll say all the managers get together on Friday and work out what happened last week and what's due to happen next week. And then they get together and find out did it happen and what's going to happen next week. And that sort of focuses the attention of your project team. So a recurring task can be quite a good idea in your project. And you might recognise this project. Does anybody recognise it? It's the one you did in week 1 when you learnt how to use Microsoft Project. So load up that project and add in the recurring tasks just so you can understand how they work. And incidentally, if I clicked on that, what do you think would happen to all these lines down here? If I clicked on that, they'd disappear. They're still there, but they'd disappear. But be careful, because project is clever enough to set them up, but if you then change your project, things can go a little bit wrong. And you'll see that in practice when you try the case study from the back of the lecture notes on Word that tells you how to set up stuff for a project. Now we can also indent and outdent in Microsoft Project, and that's the way you'd set up some phases. And what we've got here is we're redecorating an office, and you've got something called fit cable system, and that's a phase, and it consists of these 4 tasks. So when you've chased the walls, fit the conduit, connected and tested and made good the walls, you've completed fit the cable subsystem. So what we do is we type in all of this information, and I've made the links between those 4 tasks, these 4 here. I now mark those as a range by clicking and dragging with the mouse, and then I click the indent key, which is an arrow, that points in that direction that you'll all see when you get onto your computers. And suddenly, instead of seeing this little one up here that looks all sorry for itself with 1 day on it, you see 8 days. And you see a black bar. Can you see it there? Why is it 8 days? Well, if you add these together, they take 8 days. So Projects has automatically worked out that that phase, called fit cable subsystem, consists of these 4 things. You told it that. It knows how long they take, so it can work out how long the phase will take. And incidentally, if I change this to 4 days, automatically, what would happen to that? 9 days, yes. And if I click on this, what would happen to these? They'd disappear. And then you'd see a bar chart, if you like, with only the black bars on it. And that's good for senior managers to look at the high level of the project. So senior managers see an 8-year project in terms of those black bars. Not the 1.5 million tasks, but maybe a couple of hundred black bars. And that makes it much easier for them to look at the strategy and the procedures on your projects. So that's how to indent something. Why might you do it? Well, here's an example. If you've done any computer programming, you'll be familiar with nesting. But the way it works, the main project is to refit the office, and then that's the end of refitting the office. Within the office, there's a reception room, a boardroom, a committee room, and within the boardroom, for example, we're going to fit a cable subsystem, which means chasing the walls. So gradually, you go further in, and there are layers of phases and tasks and subtasks, just as appropriate for your particular project. So that's indenting. It means doing this, but maybe more than once, depending on the level of detail you need. We've talked about that, so I'm not going to talk through that now, but different types of links. Well, here is an example of some different types of links. And the one we're familiar with is this one stops and this one starts. Remember, we call them ABC, but Project calls them 1, 2, 3, like in Excel on a spreadsheet. But then this 1 here means A, doesn't it? So B can't start till A has finished. That 1 tells you that, and you can see a finish to start link. The only one you've seen so far. So what does 2FF mean then? 2 is B, isn't it? And I've got a finish to finish link with B. So C has a finish to finish link with B. And can you see that's actually happening there? These two finish at the same time. And these two start at the same time. So that's a 4SS. 4 is D, and 4SS means these two will start at the same time in your project. And you can just type 4SS, or you can double click on the name and then go through the predecessors window, whichever you prefer. So that's different types of links. You won't need it very often, but when you need it, that's how you do it. Now next, the lags and the leads. Well, here is an example of some lags and leads. And this one, FS means finish to start, our normal link. So this is B will start after A finishes, but with a +2 day lag. So A finishes, 2 days later, B starts. Can you see the lag there? Yeah. And that's because we've typed in that, or we've double clicked on B and set the lag through the task information window. That's whichever you prefer. And this one, 2FS, and then -2 days. So when this one finishes, 2 days earlier, this one starts.
In the case of the B, is it necessary to put the FS?
Yes. If you can't just say 1 + 2 days because it will get confused. So you'd have to type 1FS + 2 days. But if you double click, it's much easier to do, funnily enough. But you can try that when you get in the room. Now then, we can also talk about splitting the tasks. Now I promise you this takes a bit of practice. I'll have to go around holding your hand a little bit, or your mouse anyway, when we try and do this. But the way it works is like this. So we've got a task A, which is going to be 4 days long. Here it is. And normally it will be just 4 days in a row, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. But what we've done, as you can see, is split it into 3 chunks. So I'm going to do a day of it, have a gap, and then another gap, and that's in total 4 days. But it's spread now over about, I don't know, 8 days, is it? But it's only 4 days of paid work. Okay? That's the key point. And how do we do it? Well, we click on here, which is the split task icon, and you put your mouse on there, drag it along, click and drag until you got it where you want it. If that's not right, you can just click and drag that back to remove that split if you want to. It'll take some practice, but that's what you're here for, and you'll soon learn how to split your tasks. Now, adding constraints. The last thing that you'll be doing today is adding in some constraints. And I'll give you an example of a constraint. Suppose you are building that 3-bedroom house and you've got to attend a local authority planning meeting. Well, suppose your house building is running a bit late. Can you ring up the local authority and say, excuse me, could you delay your local authority planning meeting by a couple of weeks? I'm not ready. When they finish laughing, what will they say?
No.
No. Nobody on earth can change a local authority planning meeting date. It's set in complete concrete or stone. And that would be an example of what's called a must start on constraint. So that task, which is attend local authority planning meeting, will have a must start on constraint attached to it. Because that date cannot be changed. Whatever happens to your project, that date cannot be changed. Got it? But that's only one example of a possible constraint. There are many others, but basically don't set constraints unless you have to, because by including constraints in your projects, you make them harder to organize and to run and less likely to be successful. So minimize the number of constraints. And here are the possible constraints that you could have. Once you get the hang of it, it's pretty obvious. ASAP, as soon as possible. ALP, as late as possible. Start no later than. So what will be SNET then? SNET, start no earlier than. That's it, you got the idea of it. So ASAP, that's a default constraint. So when you don't ask for a constraint, which you haven't so far, you end up with that one. And if you want to remove a constraint, put it back to as soon as possible. So if you make a mistake and introduce a constraint, then get rid of it by setting it back to as soon as possible. All right? But there are some more. There's 3 there, and there are 5 there. We've already seen the must start on, but there's a must finish on as well. And there's a FNET, means what? FNET, finish now. Yeah, and that's the complete list of possible constraints. So it's those, and it's these. Is it a complete list? Can you think of any others? If you do think of any others, let me know and I'll sell the idea to Microsoft. Okay? But that's a complete list of constraints. Now, what you should be doing. When you get into the seminars this afternoon or next Friday morning, there's a case study at the back and it's going to end up looking like this, or it should do. And it's different from what we've seen before because to start with, can you see I've got 3 different phases? Phase A has got A1 and A2 and an end of A, which is a little milestone with a date on it. Got it? And that black bar spans those 2 things. And this black bar spans those 3 things and it's got another milestone on it. So the staff aim at that, these staff aim at that, and these staff aim at that. And that's what we're hoping you will end up building up today. And then next week in the lecture, we're going to start adding resources to the tasks. And when we do that, we're going to have costs on our projects for the first time. Because so far, nothing you've done has involved any cost. Next week, it will. Okay, that's it. Thank you. I'll publish the recording as soon as I can.